Spread the fire, fam. Welcome back to SMWX, and on today's episode I have a fantastic interview with two of South Africa's most luminous minds on political and legal matters, respectively. I have uGogo Aubrey Machikri, who's well known to this channel, one of the most popular guests we've had on this channel, and also Advocate Moses Kakane, one of the country's leading senior advocates, and also a person of great political activist pedigree too. I hope you enjoyed this conversation between the three of us. Like, share, subscribe, and make sure that you stay locked on SMWX for 2022. Let's get into it. Aye. Advocate Kakane, thank you so much for joining us today on SMWX for the second time.
Thank you, Sizwe. I'm glad to be here.
And Thokoza Gogo, thank you very much for joining us and gracing us on SMWX. I think this channel should just be called SMWX/M for Machikri, because you're the most popular guest.
Thokoza Hlobi. Thokoza Cash.
Thokozan. Well, you do have some competition, because one of the only most popular episodes beyond some of our conversations is my conversation with Advocate Kakane. So we'll just have to see how this one does with the both of you.
Well, in that case, it will have to be settled on looks.
Exactly. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us on this platform. I know the audience is extremely excited, and I wanted to kick off by simply asking you how you react to Minister Lindiwe Sisulu's article entitled "Hey Mzansi, Have We Seen Justice?", which has started the political year off with something of a bang. Perhaps I'll start with you, Advocates Kakane.
Well, Sizwe, my reaction to it is that it starts an important debate, because it deals with much more than just the judiciary. Although people have focused on the judiciary, it critiques our worldview, it critiques our political settlement, it critiques our constitutional dispensation and whether it does what it was designed to do. So it's a debate I welcome. When it comes to the judiciary, we must also understand that the judiciary is a product of political discussion in any given society, right? It doesn't come from anywhere else. So if you want to improve, enhance your judiciary, you will start by having proper political discussion. And so I see it that way. That's how I welcome her critique. I must say, Sizwe, that the people who send shivers down my spine in the past 2 weeks are those who have suggested that she can't make this debate. She can't say the things she's saying. Those people we should fear. I fear them. I had shivers down my spine just listening to people coming down on a citizen who is saying stuff that they may not like. I think we shouldn't go that route. So her freedom to express her views, regardless of how we see her motives, that we can debate later. I think it's an important debate, and the Constitution, the Quran, the Bible are all documents that must be debated.
Gogo?
Well, I was intrigued more by the response to the article than the article itself. But if you combine the two, that is the article itself and the response to the article, we will not have the time to discuss the general point I'm about to raise, but I will raise it anyway. That there are a few things that the article together with the response tell us about the state of the country. And I deliberately not say the state of a nation, because we are not a nation. I'd rather limit myself to saying this debate tells us a lot about the state of the country. Now, if you limit yourself to the four corners of the article, and you do not remove or separate the argument from the author. In other words, if your emphasis is less on the argument and more on the author, certain questions do arise. As Advocate Skakane, who I will call Muzi from now onwards, I think I've shown enough respect now. As Muzi has alluded to, we will have to look at what were her motives. And there are certain questions which arise out of that. Why now? Has the need for such an article not arisen before? What makes it arise today? Which takes us straight to what her motives may have been. In my own view, almost always, when politicians engage with such issues, they are motivated by a mixture of two things, the noble and the ignoble. And I suspect this is the case here. Another thing is to remember that words are not always what they describe. The word cat, C-A-T, is not a cat. And therefore, the words she uses in her argument are not necessarily what they describe, even necessarily what she intends to describe. And therefore, in part, the debate must be about the extent to which we must bridge the gap between the words and what they describe, or between the words and what she intended them to describe. But just to latch on, finally, on the point Muzi makes about elements of the response to the article. I found some of the responses, to be frank, quite frightening, because you have those who seem to be saying she cannot make the argument that she made. Now, we can quibble about the quality of the argument. We can quibble about the correctness of the argument. I think one thing we should all agree upon is that she has the right to say what she said. I suppose when we continue, we will look at issues such as freedom of expression and whether in any way the article violates that part of our constitution. But let me also say this. I was also not surprised by the response I found frightening, because the article does challenge a particular worldview. It challenges a way of seeing, a way of being, and a way of doing that has become dominant. And therefore, we must bear in mind that every constitution, including our own, represents the triumph of a particular dominant worldview in that particular society.
Well, I think we've just kicked off with two fascinating reflections, and from here to the viewers, we've agreed we're going to have more of a conversation rather than just me asking the questions, and so it'll be a trialogue from here on in between the three of us. But from what both of you say, I think there are very useful ways of distinguishing some of the different things that have been happening. On the one hand, the article itself and the strengths and weaknesses of the argument, and in many ways the conclusions, some of which I agree with, but the arrival at those conclusions I have some problems with in terms of the way the argument actually unfolded. But the conclusions themselves, I think, are not just Minister Sisulu's conclusions. They've been reached by a number of important thinkers and scholars across the legal and intellectual spectrum. And so that's the one thing. The other thing is the debate that ensued after the article and the silencing of those who agree with the conclusions, if not the arguments that led to those conclusions, and an attempt to close the political debate around a narrow consensus and to make it almost a heresy to even challenge the Constitution or criticize or critique the Constitution. And I think there was evidence of that in the media. Whether coordinated or not, who knows, but even if uncoordinated, there was this just outpouring of almost shaming the idea that the Constitution is not perfect. And then finally, there's the broader debate, the deeper debate about the constitutional order, which this is just one part of, which it seems we're not having. It's either the Constitution is perfect and anyone who criticizes it is a villain and the devil incarnate, or the Constitution is the worst document that's ever been written, and anyone who agrees with it is President Ramaphosa's spokesperson. And somewhere between that extreme, we're not having the debate. We need to be having the deeper debate about, well, how far is this Constitution taking us towards, and not just the Constitution, the whole legal order, the whole legal system of which the Constitution is just a part. How far is this taking us towards a more just and a less unjust society? Feel free to come in and respond as you feel.
You know, let's start. First of all, both Minister Sisulu and those who critique her argument are entitled to express those views, and I have no difficulty with that. I have difficulties with people who seem to be defending a particular worldview and come down on anyone who challenges whiteness, who challenges the fact that we live in a country with ravages of colonial and apartheid system. And they come down on anyone critiquing that. And I think that is a problem. And we must know that from the beginning, Sizwe, if we are to judge our constitutional democracy, we must judge it by what the Constitution itself tells us we are moving the country away from. First of all, colonialism was grand theft of land. Colonialism was grand theft of wealth. Colonialism was grand theft of a people and their culture. Colonialism placed the majority of people on the margins of the human condition. So if you are changing that system, the only way to judge whether you've done enough is to check how far you're doing with that. Where do your majority of South Africans live? Where are they developmental-wise? Where are they in terms of education, in terms of equality, in terms of jobs, in terms of health and transport? We cannot judge our political settlement without critiquing whether or not this neoliberal outlook has delivered to the masses that we're seeking to free. And so those people, I don't blame Minister Sisulu or those who critique her, because they are correct. They have the space to do so. What I think we must do, if we are truly committed to the freedom of expression as expressed in the Constitution, well, we must know that the fact that ideas hurt us or we don't like them cannot trump the right to freedom of expression. An ego of a judge or a politician or anybody or a journalist cannot trump a citizen's freedom to express what they want. We do not have to tolerate views only because they make us comfortable. And I think that, for me, is something we must do. And as lawyers and as judges and as the executive, we must also be prepared to face robust debate about our own outlook. The law is Western in nature, and there is no insult in stating that. To say that lawyers like myself, who speak English as I am now, and judges do so because our outlook is Western is not an insult, it's an observation, and it's a start of a debate about substantive transformation of society to favor the African majority. And lastly, Sizwe, this idea that you can't criticize the judiciary is absolute nonsense. No holder of public power should escape criticism. Now, of course, no one should be insulted, but to suggest that in order to criticize the judiciary, you must write a paper where you cite cases means my mother can't criticize judges. And I think that elitist view that in order to criticize holders of public power, who are the judges, we must get a law professor or a senior counsel, is just the exclusion, constitutes the exclusion of the large majority of South Africans from critiquing holders of power.
Well, Shubi, one of the questions I kept on asking myself as the debate was raging is, to what end are we having this debate and similar debates in the past? And to what end should we have similar debates in future? And here we need to remind ourselves of a few things. This debate arises because of a particular historical context. It arises because of contending conceptions of historical and collective memory. Now, another thing we must remind ourselves of is why we engaged in a struggle against apartheid colonialism. We did so to create a society that is the antithesis of apartheid society. But that was never going to be an end in itself. Beyond that lies the task of creating a society that itself is the antithesis of this society, which is the antithesis to apartheid society. Which means the task of renewing our society, socially, culturally, politically, economically, is eternal. It's a never ending task, which means as part of that understanding, the task of looking at the Constitution and our constitutional order and whether it should be reviewed is a never-ending task itself. Why this is not understood is just that a misunderstanding and to some extent deliberate. Because remember, the article talks about colonialism, is peppered with many references to colonialism, the colonized and the colonizer. Now, for me, what is critical is coloniality. Because colonialism in formal terms is over. Coloniality, the logic which gave us colonialism, is very much alive in countries such as South Africa, a country which is in Africa but is not an African country. Now, we must also remember that this logic, coloniality, its origins is the idea or reside in the idea that those who are not white are epistemologically inferior, incapable of creating and grasping knowledge. And that they are ontologically inferior, they are either not human, and to the extent that they are not as human as those who are white. And therefore, one of the things which lie at the center of this debate, seen or unseen, is whiteness. And here we're not talking about skin color. We're talking about the worldview, we're talking about an ideology, we're talking about ways of seeing, ways of being, and ways of doing, which in South Africa have become dominant. What else has become dominant? With the dominant worldview, what has emerged is a particular idea about what institutional arrangements and other arrangements should govern society, which ideas should be dominant in society. And as a result, because I've already said that any constitution anywhere in the world represents the triumph of a particular worldview, this constitution represents the triumph of a worldview that in its origin is governed by the logic of coloniality. And if we understand and accept that, and we accept that we must engage in the never-ending task of renewing our society, we must then also understand that this cannot happen successfully unless all voices are heard in this regard.
And it's such a shame that in public discourse, especially in the private media space in South Africa, we're constantly denied this debate, and we're constantly told who the hero or heroine is and who the villain or the devil is, and we create this climate of this enthusiastic climate where we just run to extremes, and we write certain people off and we lift others up, and I love that we're not holding back today in today's discussion. And I've just got a number of observations based on what you've said, which I'd be very interested to hear your reflections on. But firstly, to be honest, I'm quite worried, and if you can't comment on this, feel free, but I'm quite worried about how suddenly the acting Chief Justice is now being elevated, just like President Ramaphosa was elevated for a while, into, there's a category in the media for, this is the person who needs to be defended, protected, and raised to an unimpeachable pedestal. And anyone who taints or criticizes this person, even fairly, is persona non grata. And it's dangerous for me to elevate any public official who holds any power to this level of almost being unquestionable. Having said that, and let me make a second point here, I think it is reasonable for those who are supporters and defenders of the Constitution to ask, well, what is it about this constitutional order, or what is it about the Constitution itself or the constitutional text with which you actually take issue? And I have a response for that, actually, now that they ask. Firstly, I love what Ubabs Kakane said about colonialism, and I would replace the preamble of the Constitution with those lines of Babs Kakane. Nowhere do we mention colonialism. Nowhere do we mention apartheid. We just, when we narrate our history in the preamble, before we even get into the text, we just talk about the past, which, I mean, is the past, as Professor Tsepo Madlingozi says, is it the South African War? Is it the past relating to, it's just everyone's the past. No, we had a devastating history of colonialism, and we want to uproot that in addition to apartheid. And we don't have the guts in our Constitution to name that problem. We just prefer airy-fairy references to the past. In the founding provisions, Section 1, where we talk about non-racialism and non-sexism, I have a problem with this idea of non-racialism. I don't think it goes far enough to deliver racial justice. I think we should really be more explicit, because non-racialism is so easy to be co-opted. I understand its important history, going back to Sobukwe and others, but non-racialism now is just as much DA propaganda as it is, Pan-Africanist thought. And I don't think that term takes us far enough towards racial justice. And then finally, when we look at the conspectus of rights in Section 2, I'm prepared to concede and actually agree that political rights have been vastly extended, whether that's freedom of expression, although depends who you're criticizing, whether that's voting rights, whether that's, freedom of assembly, whether that's, your ability to engage in cultural practices, etc. So I think we've done well to expand political rights. But it really does seem to me, the closer and closer I look at the Constitution, that economic questions, barring basic necessities like food and water and sanitation, economic questions were just ducked. And we don't say anything about, how the distribution of wealth should look in this country. And for me, with such an unjust country, to just ignore economics and economic power is a contributor, not to say the executive hasn't done its best to exacerbate the crisis, but contributes to the injustice and inequality that we see.
Yeah, Sizwe, I've always said you can't solve a problem you are scared to pronounce, even to pronounce. And I think this paper by Minister Sisulu is important to me. Forget about, I have my criticism of Minister Sisulu and the ANC and them speaking left and turning right. I'll come to that. I think if you can't pronounce the problem, you can't solve it. And you correctly point out the wishy-washy statements in the Constitution. But that just characterizes our debate in South Africa. We're so scared of white power that we don't want to call it by its name because it controls wealth. It puts people on the boards of companies. And so even our leaders are scared of calling out the ravages and dangers of white privilege and white power. And that's why we are unable to even understand that those who've come down on Minister Sisulu, largely, not all of them, do so in order to defend the continued survival of white privilege and white power. And most of them are just poster boys of that white power. And they are sent to critique everyone, to come down on everyone who has the audacity to call white power by its name. And I think we must be afraid when that happens in the country. When the info scandal happened in South Africa, it was when our journalists and our commentators have bought into the propaganda machine of the apartheid regime and had elevated it to a point where there was no criticism. And I think it's important, the point you make. I was quite scared when I saw academics, so-called professors and journalists, truly coming down on a person for expressing a view. And they were not critiquing what she was saying. And I think basically only Padili Hutla and Bishop Clyde Ramalaine even attempted to deal with what we can learn from her. The rest of the people, I think they were just going for her because they think it disturbs the balance of power in society. And I think this is where you're right. For as long as our Constitution does not mention the things we must deal with, the substantive issues of changing a society from that created by colonialism to a truly free society, we've not done anything. And this whole backlash is nothing but subservience to white power, to white economic power that we are too scared to confront. And I think we must have a more open debate about ourselves than we are. It is not wrong to critique the Quran, the Bible, and the Constitution and any other document in order to advance society.
The climate in which this debate is happening, in my view, is decidedly unintellectual, more worrying, anti-intellectual, and even more worrying, anti-democratic. But to go back to the point of whiteness, a point I must complete, because I said I'm not just talking about complexion, we must bear in mind that some of the purveyors of whiteness, by a co-option or other means, are people who are not white. Now, Why are we afraid of naming the problem? And why should we, as you say, are we ducking the economic issue?
Spread the fire, fam. Welcome back to SMWX. And on today's episode, I have a fantastic interview with two of South Africa's most luminous minds on political and legal matters, respectively. I have Ugogo Aubrey Machikri, who's well known to this channel, one of the most popular guests we've had on this channel, and also Advocate Moses Kakane, one of the country's leading senior advocates, and also a person of great political activist pedigree too. I hope you enjoy this conversation between the three of us. Like, share, subscribe, and make sure that you stay locked on SMWX for 2022. Let's get into it. Aye.
Why are we afraid to name the problem? And as you are saying, Subi, why are we afraid to tackle the economic question? Why are we ducking it? Now, if you go back to the Freedom Charter and the Constitution, I suspect when I look at certain formulations in both, that the answer to this question is that things that may offend white people should not be said. In other words, the authors of the Freedom Charter and the authors of the Constitution, consciously, unconsciously or otherwise, seem to have decided that there will be no formulation in the Freedom Charter, there will be no formulation in our Constitution that will offend those who benefited from the crime of colonialism and the crime of apartheid. But what that betrays is the extent to which nothing has changed. In other words, those who held power, economic and otherwise, during colonialism, and those who held power during apartheid are still the ones who hold power today. And therefore today, you can't have ideas propounded. You can't have formulations of ideas that will offend those who hold power partly because their worldview, their ways of seeing, their ways of doing, and their ways of being remain dominant. And so what we have here is a situation where in this debate, if you ignore problems with the article by the minister, the nub of the argument challenges the status quo. And we are not going to have that. We are not going to have that precisely because when a worldview becomes dominant, it must be imposed, it must be reinforced, and it must be reproduced so that it becomes so commonsensical that those who hold a different view fall outside a canon of rational opinion. And therefore what they think is deemed irrational. Now the danger, of course, here is that we must always bear in mind, as I have said in the past, that every cause, no matter how noble, has its tyrants. Now, defense of democracy and that which is democratic comes disguised as all sorts of things, including tyranny. Let me repeat that point. The commitment to democracy and that which is democratic comes disguised as all sorts of opportunistic things, including tyranny. I think to some extent, it is this tyranny the debate about Lindiwe Sisulu's article.
I was struck by the reference to the Freedom Charter, Gogo, which already, as you say, maybe deviates from some of the principles espoused by the broader liberation struggle. But you might even argue that the Constitution deviates even further from that deviation. So when we look at, again, the preamble, which I understand has no real legal force, but it's supposed to narrate the history of the country and explain why we have this new constitution. We find this line, we the people of South Africa, the various other lines, and then believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, comma, united in our diversity. I mean, it just, what does that even mean? I mean, why do we need to add this extra clause just to make sure that we're not really going the Freedom Charter route? Don't worry, it's Freedom Charter light. And again, when I hear the mindless defense of the Constitution, sure, there's a nuanced defense of the Constitution, which I think we all welcome. But there's an equally mindless defense of the Constitution, which is the same as the mindless attack on the Constitution, which isn't looking at the text and is just making wild claims about it. But really, I don't see those who defend the Constitution explaining to us why we needed to add that extra clause to this clause which comes from the Freedom Charter to somehow diminish the Freedom Charter clause just so it's palatable. To who? Well, you be the judge. So it just seems to me that the Constitution represents something of a deviation from the liberation struggle, and the difference between those two explains to some extent why we are in the crisis we are in. And I'm not saying, and I have to stress this, I'm not saying that the Constitution is the only thing to blame. And this is where I do take issue with Minister Sisulu's article, because she speaks of politicians in the article, and those politicians are ANC politicians who have, in my view, contributed vastly to the crisis that we're in now, and in some ways participated in the apartheid-like injustices of the present. So, but I believe we can say both. I think we can say, yes, ANC politicians have failed dramatically, and we have a structural crisis which is linked to the economy and the way that the legal order inscribes and reinscribes our economic injustices. And I just wanted to end on that point by saying that maybe the question is not so much just about the Constitution, although I think the Constitution is imperfect and flawed in certain respects, especially in the values sections and the early sections. But maybe the question is about the legal order as a whole, of which the Constitution supposedly and theoretically sits at the apex. But we've got all these sources of law and all these case laws that have to be brought from old eras into the new. And then we have legal cultures and the design of courtrooms that also come from, from past eras, and legal attire and language, as Babs Kakane has already mentioned, the predominance of English. Even if our Constitution is all that it's cracked up to be, it still seems to me that the whole legal order itself is still far, far from even moving away from the inheritances that we have been given from colonialism and apartheid. And it's almost as if the Constitution diverts us from looking at the whole legal order itself, which seems to still re-entrench in some ways apartheid patterns.
but Khakani obviously knows much more about this than I do and has seen it up close. But it seems to me we're not having the conversation about the legal order, and we're confining the conversation just to the Constitution.
Yeah, I think you're right, Sizwe. I mean, it's not just Marxist, but I think it's a fact of life that law will tend to be dominated by a dominant class in that society. Look at people who are defending the Constitution. Tell me who they are and what class are they? Is the Constitution being defended by the multitudes of our people in New Brighton, in Guamasho, in Following, in Guyana? No, it's being defended by people who in some way are defending the stability that we have of the status quo. Whether they are black or white, but it's people who are defending or legitimizing inequality, inadvertently or consciously, but that's the effect. And the legal order that we need to have in a country that emerges from colonialism is a legal order that is the antithesis of what you're coming out from. And that is what we must understand. And I think the problem with lawyers and journalists and judges and politicians, I've always said, have very little capacity for self-reflection. In fact, most of them are
political analysts involved.
Political analysts, particularly who are
YouTube show hosts.
Yeah. Is that what we are seeing now? Look at the NGOs that have come down on the minister. These are people who pretend they defend the Constitution, and they come out to actually attack someone for expressing a view. Why? Because it's a lie. What they do is to defend the status quo. These are defenders. These are poster boys of whiteness, parading as constitutionalists. But they defend the Constitution because they know that this Constitution defends the privileges, the ill-gotten wealth that is transported from the apartheid order into the new one and must be kept like that for you and me, for Black people to remain happy in poverty and landlessness. And we create a legal order that hardly tackles that. And therefore, I didn't see the challenge, even on the judiciary, as an insult. I thought it's important for us to look at ourselves and see whether we've not become party to ensuring the continued survival of the very white power, the very Western notions of our life that we sought to fight. And so we must be careful. When I saw the Deputy Chief Justice on TV, I feared him. I feared that the court can come down on society, on someone about expressing their view. We must be more tolerant than that, and our courts and our leaders must be more tolerant even of robust criticism, because it is on that basis that we will beat the vestiges of colonialism, the vestiges of apartheid, and the inequality that is in our society. Is both politicians and judges and journalists who must be more tolerant. My criticism of the ANC and maybe of Minister Sisulu is that I've often watched that the ANC itself entrenches this neoliberal outlook. And so I'm very skeptical when an ANC leader talks left, because usually as soon as they're elected, they become part of this neoliberal outlook that is the same as that of the DA, the same of that of the Nationalist Party, and every capitalist champion in society. And so I'm skeptical. I think we need more changes from society, and we must imagine our lives and our freedom without the ANC and challenge the system that sometimes the ANC defends soon after elections.
Well, Khubi, when I read the article by the minister, one of the things I saw, rightly or wrongly, is an attempt on her part to position herself outside the problem. And what is the problem? The problem is that the ANC our leaders have become allies of coloniality. That's the problem. And there's an attempt in this article to position herself outside the problem. And this opens her up to the accusation that she is just being opportunistic to achieve the end of becoming the president of the ANC and maybe the president of the country. So this is one of the things I saw in reading this article. Now, to go back to the question of the rule of law, she is right to ask the question, whose rule of law? Because the rule of law is not an objective reality. The rule of law comes into existence as a result of subjective conceptions of the rule of law coming into conflict and into battle. And a particular conception of the rule of law then triumphs. This is what has happened here. A particular conception of the rule of law has triumphed in South Africa. It exists in part to defend the following. The land must remain in white hands. The economy must remain in white hands. And white people must be in charge of our legal system. That's what it exists in part to defend. And I then ask the question, when a worldview, ways of seeing, ways of doing, and ways of being have become dominant, and the counter-hegemonic cannot see the light of day, even to the extent that the counter-hegemonic represents better alternatives. Is it then, I kept on asking myself when I looked at the ferocity with which Lindiwe Sisulu was attacked, is it then possible for white people to give up the land peacefully? Is it possible for white people to give up the economy peacefully? Is it possible for them to give up their control of the legal system peacefully? In other words, I am convinced that one of the things that must happen for change to happen in South Africa is that white magnanimity must kick in. I am not holding my breath because all I see is the rampant arrogance of whiteness, which means white magnanimity is not going to kick in. If white magnanimity is not going to kick in, what must kick in for South Africa to go through fundamental change and transformation? And is that kicking in possible by peaceful means? That's the question I ask. And by saying so, because in this country, we have a state that will take you to jail, or will attempt at least, if you say certain things, and we'll pretend we are saying another, so that they can harass you. I'm not calling for violence. But violence can happen without the spilling of blood. I am talking about whether fundamental change in South Africa is possible without a certain element of social, political, and economic instability. That's the question I ask.
Sizwe, let me answer this question.
By all means, by all means.
I'm going to be more blunt than Aubrey asks or poses the question. First, we are where we are because we have a settlement that did not match the violent nature of colonialism and apartheid. And the white arrogance Aubrey is talking about happens because those who maimed us, those who killed us, those who placed the entire population on the margins of the human condition, those who kept generations where they are, have never faced the violence through which they put us. And this compromise settlement and white arrogance are a product of a settlement that was designed to appease them. Violence begets violence. And so poverty is violent to the poor. Colonialism was violent. Apartheid was violent. Gender discrimination, we know, is violent. And what then do you do to do away with a system that is violent, that continues to impose itself on people who already for centuries have gone through violence? Is that I'm calling for this. I think society in general must rise up against this state, against this system that their generations, their forefathers went through. When I say they must rise up, I mean fundamentally to correct the shortcomings of our political settlement. I'm not saying they must be violent, because it seems like we can no longer go there. Because we can no longer go there, because I do support something called a just war, but it just can't happen. But I think we cannot live our lives as if things are normal when Black people have to tolerate the mere fact that they have political rights that you talked about, but will live in poverty for the rest of their lives. And once in a while, this system co-opts Sizwe, co-opts Muzi, co-opts Aubrey to defend it. But what are we defending? We're defending a system that will put down our people, Black people, for a very, very long time. And I think it's time people imagined their lives outside the political parties, defied white power, rise up against this system, go to the streets if they must, peacefully, but they must completely overthrow the system that has continued to put us where we are. If we don't do that, Sizwe, our generations to come will blame us. And I think it's important that we do this, not because we hate anybody, because we love our people and we love our generations, we love our children. We cannot bequeath to them our coward ways and our failures to correct colonialism because we get co-opted by the system that we have.
Let me just add this quickly, Toby, before you come in. Jill Scott Heron says the revolution will not be televised. I say the revolution will not happen in English, because the imposition of this worldview in South Africa happens in the main through English. And therefore, to speak in English is to be rational. Not to speak English is to be irrational. So here we are hyperventilating in English about this article by Minister Sisulu, forgetting that the preponderance of the people who are talking about, who still bear the brunt of neo-apartheid, do not suffer neo-apartheid in English. So we are, those of us who engage with social, political, and economic reality in this country in English, we are doing something that is akin to playing with ourselves, if you get what I mean. Because the majority of those who are talking about, we cannot hear, not because they don't have a voice, they do have a voice. We don't hear the voice. We don't hear the voice because it is not in English. So,
yeah, and it circles back to the Constitution as well, which I'm sure there are translations and you know, there are tokenistic gestures towards making our courtrooms and our justice system more representative, but quite frankly, the only game in town is English. The only culture in town is a legal culture and a legal set of attires, etc., inherited from outside. It still baffles me that we can even watch a case in the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom where people wear suits. Yet here we still have to have a system where our attire is actually more archaic than the English Supreme Court attire, for example. And Gogo, Baba, I think because I can suddenly see another hour of conversation on the horizon, but I'm conscious of your time. I know that the audience will be begging us to do this again, but one day. But what I wanted to end on, and I'll come to both of you on this, is I think there is a certain responsibility that those of us who are critiquing and criticizing the status quo have, which is trying at least to start looking at painting what an alternative can look like. And of course, no one person can do this. It's a collective effort. It will probably take multiple generations. But for me, I think one of the problems that we have when we critique the status quo is that people then say, well, the alternative is more dangerous than the stability of the present. So I'd prefer stability to the unknown. And for me, I think it's about changing the perspective and saying that actually we critique because there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity to have a more just society. There's an opportunity to unlock economic redistribution. There's an opportunity to deal a blow to injustice. And we can't get to that kind of society if we believe that everything we have at the moment is perfect and it's just the ANC government's failures that stand between us and this more just society. So for me, it's how do we create alternatives and an even more just order, an even more just constitution, an even more racially just, gender just society. That's the ultimate aim and the ultimate goal that we are driving towards. It's not just chaos and destruction. It's actually something better than what we have right now, which quite frankly as a status quo is far from speaking for itself. And that for me is the project. I just find it so unoriginal for intellectuals and establishment voices to defend the status quo, which is so indefensible. Surely our task as those speaking into society is to think of something better than the version of South Africa or whatever this country will one day be called than we currently have.
Well, this is a part of what the last point you make. I'm usually in despair when I watch our intellectuals on TV because I'm beginning to think the problem is in our education system. We're just not taught critical thinking, that people are happy to be fed a particular hegemonic discourse, and there's no original thought. And that is why they are unable to think outside what's available. Secondly, is when you talk about choosing the stability we have rather than the unknown. Sizwe, that statement is something you, me, and Aubrey and others can afford, because the stability of what we have is not a night without food and blankets. It's not a night without a roof. So this stability, this state of affairs we call stability, we say so because we are middle class. Poverty is not stability. Landlessness is not stability. And so for millions of people that we, as Aubrey says, we don't see and we don't hear, the situation is in havoc right now, every day for them. And so we are sitting on a time bomb as we talk amongst ourselves, as Aubrey calls it, playing with ourselves. Because we are a minority, we just have a voice. And one day, if we don't confront these things, We don't confront our own neoliberal outlook in policy making. We don't confront our own fear of whiteness. We don't confront our own ability to get co-opted into a system that makes us undermine our own people. Nothing will change. So we need to call upon everybody to engage with the good constitution that we have, to see in what ways we can make sure that it advances society and improves the plight of the poor. Because if we don't, Sizwe, we are sitting on a civil war waiting to happen. Thank you.
Well, I think Mboma is correct, because I keep on asking the question, what is the end game when we have this discussion? And I will repeat the point that I made right at the beginning, that the struggle against apartheid colonialism was a struggle for the creation of a society that would be the antithesis of apartheid society. But that society, which is the antithesis of apartheid society, is not an end in itself. What must follow is another struggle. A struggle to create a society that itself is the antithesis of that society, which is the antithesis of apartheid society. And as I said, this is an unending task. It's a task we cannot engage in if we do not do what was said by an Egyptian author who said, politics is the art of the possible. Revolution is the art of the impossible. Furthermore, this fear of the known, we can articulate that argument in terms of the ideas of J. Krishnamurti, probably my favorite philosopher, who talks about the imperative of freeing ourselves from the known. One of the reasons we're here in South Africa today is the known. And our refusal or inability to free ourselves from the known. Now, of course, to free yourself from the known does not mean you must discard the known, because you must know that from which you must free yourself. And what we must free ourselves from are the ravages of colonialism, apartheid, and the neo-apartheid of today. Now, of course, the moment you free yourself from the known, another struggle begins. To free yourself from that which you have come to know now. That too is an unending task. Now, that unending task means that we have the world as it is and the world as we want it to be. Now, South Africa of 2022, as the world that it is today, and our dream of what the world must become, means that we must ask ourselves two questions. Must change occur within the paradigm or outside the current paradigm? And if we look at the time and series of actions that must take place for fundamental change to occur, it seems to me conversations must be about change within the current paradigm, which opens the way for change outside the current paradigm. My final word is to our judiciary, particularly the Constitutional Court, assuming rightly or wrongly that Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo was speaking on behalf of the Constitutional Court. in his hysterical response to the minister. My advice to them, if you are speaking on their behalf, is that there is a worrying tendency on their part. They seem to have very thin skins. They seem to be hypersensitive to criticism. And as Muz was saying, our constitutional order can't be based on the egos of judges. It must be based on something much more substantive and much more substantial. And my advice, therefore, to them is please grow a thicker skin.
Well, Baba, thank you so much for joining us on SMWX. This was one of the most incredible conversations. And it's just so refreshing because you just can't find conversations of this kind in our media, on our media landscape, or very rarely. So it was a great honor and a privilege to have both of you, such towering minds in your various fields, gracing our audience. And thank you so much for taking the time. I am sure we will have so many views, and I will be sure to keep you updated with how far this conversation extends. But thank you so much.
All right,
okay. Thanks.